There is a terrifying rhythm to history, a heartbeat that has stopped and restarted civilization exactly 5 times in the last 2 millennia. This is not about reform. This is not about a market correction. This is about a total system reset. Complete, absolute erasure of debt through 3 specific mechanisms: hyperinflation, government decree, or total war. We saw it in ancient Rome in 33 AD. We watched it burn through medieval Europe in 1347. It decapitated the aristocracy in revolutionary France in 1789. It destroyed the middle class in Weimar Germany in 1923. And it redrew the map of the world in 1953. 5 distinct eras, 5 different triggers. But every single time, the collapse followed the exact same 6-stage mathematical sequence leading to annihilation. In every instance, the ruling elites promised the debt was manageable. Every time, the bankers said, "This time is different." And every single time, the mathematics proved them wrong. The debt was erased, the currency was destroyed, and wealth was transferred from the hands of the ignorant to the hands of the prepared on a scale that makes modern billionaires look like paupers. Fast forward to right now. The year is 2025. Look at the numbers. Global debt has shattered the ceiling at 335% of GDP. We are staring at a $300 trillion mountain of debt resting on a fragile $90 trillion global economy. The United States alone is drowning in $36 trillion of federal obligations. Student loans, $1.7 trillion. Cars you don't own, $1.6 trillion. Credit cards maxed out for survival, $1.2 trillion. Corporate zombies walking around with $11 trillion in bad paper. Let me be crystal clear. It is mathematically impossible to repay this. The money does not exist. We have officially entered stage 3 of the 6-stage death spiral that has destroyed empires 5 times before. History dictates that stages 4, 5, and 6 will now follow with the precision of a ticking clock. The only variable left is how the reset happens. Will it be hyperinflation that turns your dollars into confetti? Will it be a government-mandated Jubilee that wipes out the creditors? Or will it be a kinetic war that physically destroys the ledger? This is not a conspiracy theory. This is pattern recognition. In this video, I am going to decode exactly how this happened 5 times before, why the indicators scream it is happening again right now, and most importantly, what this means for every dollar in your savings account, every debt on your name, and every asset you think you own. If you value the truth over comforting lies, and you want to track this pattern before it tracks you, make sure you are subscribed to the channel and have the notification bell turned on. We are building a community of the prepared, not the victims. Hit the like button right now if you refuse to be blind to history, and leave a comment below saying, "I see the pattern," so the algorithm knows we are watching. Before we walk through the terrifying historical parallels, you must understand the mechanics of a debt jubilee. It is not a policy choice. It is a mathematical inevitability. A jubilee is the cancellation of debts across an entire economy. Governments do not do this because they are generous. They do it because the alternative is the complete cessation of civilization. Here is the physics of finance. Debt is a claim on future production. When you borrow $100,000, you are promising to create that much value in the future plus interest. When the US government borrows $36 trillion, it is mortgaging the labor of unborn generations. But there is a hard limit. When the debt load exceeds the ability of the economy to produce, the system turns into a Ponzi scheme. And every Ponzi scheme has an expiration date. Do the math with me. Global GDP is $90 trillion. If we grow at an optimistic 3%, we create $2.7 trillion in new wealth a year. But global debt is $300 trillion. Even at a modest 3% interest rate, the world owes $9 trillion in interest payments alone. The economy produces $2.7 trillion. The debt demands $9 trillion. The gap is impossible. The system is insolvent. When you reach this point, the debt must die. Not restructured, not refinanced, eliminated. History gives us 3 ways out. Method 1. Hyperinflation. The printing press runs hot. Debts are paid in worthless paper, and savers are obliterated. Method 2. Jubilee. The government cancels the debt, banks collapse, and the system reboots. Method 3. War. Physical destruction renders the ledger irrelevant. There is no fourth door. Now, let's analyze the 6-stage pattern that leads us here. Stage 1. The illusion of prosperity through credit expansion. Every tragedy begins with a party. It starts with easy money that feels like wealth. People borrow, they spend, and the GDP charts go up. Governments point to this artificial growth as proof of their genius. But it is not prosperity, it is theft from the future. Look at ancient Rome, 10 to 30 AD. The credit markets exploded. Patricians lent to everyone. The Senate funded massive aqueducts and temples entirely on credit. The elite borrowed to fund lavish games and bribed their way into power. It looked like a golden age. Construction was everywhere. Luxury goods poured into the city. But it was a mirage. The construction did not generate profit. The games did not create value. It was consumption disguised as investment. By 20 AD, the Roman elite were borrowing just to pay interest on old loans to maintain their lifestyle. Look at medieval Europe, 1300. The Italian banking houses, the Medici, the Bardi, flooded the continent with credit. Kings borrowed to fight the 100 Years' War. Edward III of England took loans equivalent to billions today. Cathedrals rose, universities opened, trade flourished. But beneath the stone and stained glass, the foundation was rotting. Kings were borrowing new money just to pay off old masters. Look at Weimar Germany, 1919. Facing impossible war reparations, the government borrowed domestically to rebuild and avoid taxes. Unemployment dropped, factories hummed. It felt like a recovery, but it was built on sand. And look at the post-war West, 1950 to 1980, the greatest credit expansion in human history. The GI Bill, the housing boom, the consumer credit revolution. We built the modern world on a promise to pay it back later. That was stage one, the addiction to cheap money. But stage one always metastasizes into stage two. Stage two, the debt saturation point, 250% of GDP. There is a critical threshold where borrowing stops fueling growth and starts suffocating it. Economists pinpoint this at roughly 250% of debt to GDP. Once you cross this line, every new dollar of debt generates less than a dollar of growth. In Rome, by 30 AD, the debt was universal. Senators, merchants, commoners, everyone was underwater. In Europe by 1340, the kings of England and France owed the banks more money than their entire kingdoms could generate in taxes. The banks were leveraged 10 to 1. The credit market seized up. The easy money stopped. In France, 1780, the crown's debt interest consumed 60% of all revenue. Not the principal, just the interest. They tried to borrow more, but the lenders got scared. Rates spiked. The noose tightened. In Weimar, 1921, total debt crossed 400% of GDP. It was over before it began. And the modern world? We crossed the 250% line in 2010 after the great financial crisis. Did we stop? No. We accelerated. By 2020, before the pandemic, we were at 320%. Then we printed another $17 trillion. Today, global debt is 350% of GDP. The United States' total debt load is over 320% of GDP. We have blasted past stage two. We are now living in the consequences. This brings us to stage three. The death spiral interest consumes growth. This is the point of no return. It is the moment when the mathematics of the system turn predatory. In stage 1 and 2, debt fueled growth. In stage 3, debt eats growth alive. The system enters a debt trap, where any new economic output is immediately confiscated just to pay the interest on yesterday's mistakes. Go back to Rome, 33 AD. The borrowing party ended. Creditors, sensing the wind change, stopped lending and demanded repayment immediately. But the money wasn't there. The credit system froze. Land prices collapsed because no one could borrow to buy. The Roman elite found themselves land-rich but cash-poor, watching their wealth evaporate as interest payments consumed the empire's productive capacity. Go to medieval Europe, 1345. This was the year the music stopped. King Edward III of England looked at his ledger and realized he could not pay the Italian banks. He didn't negotiate. He defaulted. The Bardi and Peruzzi banks, the too-big-to-fail institutions of their day, collapsed instantly. Trade across the continent ground to a halt because without credit, ships don't sail. Go to France, 1788, the year before the guillotine. The French crown was spending 60% of its total revenue just to pay interest on the debt, not to fund the military, not to build roads, just to service the VIG. They were borrowing new money solely to pay the interest on old loans. In modern finance, we have a name for this, a Ponzi scheme. Go to Weimar Germany, 1922. The government owed war reparations in gold marks, but they only had paper. To make the payments, they ran the printing press. Inflation started as a slow burn, doubling prices, then doubling again. The currency began to die, but the debt remained. And the modern world? We are here, right now. Look at the United States federal budget. We are currently spending approximately $1 trillion per year just on interest payments. Let that sink in. We spend more on servicing our debt than we spend on the entire U.S. military. We spend more on interest than on education or infrastructure. U.S. GDP grows by maybe $600 billion in a good year. Interest payments are $1 trillion, Do the math. The debt is consuming more than 100% of our real growth. Every single hour you work, every dollar of value created by American businesses is already spoken for. It is being siphoned off to pay for the spending of the past. We are running on a treadmill that is speeding up while we are slowing down. This is the mathematical definition of a debt trap. And stage 3 always, inevitably, breaks into stage 4. Stage 4, mathematical insolvency, the recognition. This is the psychological turning point. This is the moment when the smart money stops listening to the politicians and starts looking at the calculator. It is the moment when the public realizes, we are not going to pay this back. Not because we don't want to, but because we physically cannot. In Rome, 33 AD, the crisis went from a liquidity problem to a solvency crisis. The Senate passed laws trying to force creditors to invest in land to prop up the market. It failed. The prisons filled with debtors. Major patrician families were exposed as insolvent. They owed more than they owned. The illusion of wealth was stripped away. In Europe, 1347. Following the banking collapse, the kings tried to restructure. They offered partial payments. They promised future revenues. But the math was brutal. England's revenue was £100,000 a year. They owed £1.5 million. It would take 15 years of 100% taxation just to pay the principal. Everyone knew it was over. The debt was worthless. In France, 1789, the finance minister, Jacques Necker, did something revolutionary. He published the numbers. He showed the public that even if France fired every soldier, stopped every construction project, and closed the government, they still couldn't pay the debt. The numbers proved the system was dead. The aristocracy refused to accept it because they were the creditors. The peasants refused to pay for it. The result was chaos. In Weimar, 1923. The currency was rapidly becoming confetti. A loaf of bread cost billions of marks. But the reparations were denominated in gold. Germany would have to produce more value than its entire economy possessed just to pay the interest. It was impossible. And in 2025, look at the US debt clock. To pay off the $36 trillion national debt while covering the interest, the United States would need to run a budget surplus of $1 trillion every single year for 36 years. We haven't run a surplus since 2001. We are running deficits of $2 trillion a year. To pay this off, we would need to raise taxes by 50% or cut all spending by 70%. Neither of these things will ever happen. The debt is unpayable. The Social Security and Medicare liabilities, another $100 trillion, are unpayable. The global debt of $300 trillion represents 3 years of total planetary output. We cannot work our way out of this. We are in stage 4, the recognition. The world is waking up to the fact that the emperor has no clothes and no money. And when this realization hits the masses, it triggers the most dangerous phase of all. This leads us to stage 5, the political fracture pressure for reset builds. Once the mathematical impossibility of repayment, stage 4, becomes clear to the public, the social contract begins to tear. The economy splits into 2 warring camps, the debtors who cannot pay and the creditors who refuse to lose. The government is trapped in the crossfire, paralyzing the political system. In Rome, 33 AD, the streets exploded. The plebeians, the common citizens, stormed the forum. They weren't just angry about poverty, they were angry about debt bondage. They demanded a Jubilee, a total erasure of the ledger. The patricians, the creditor class, refused. To cancel the debt was to wipe out their wealth. The gridlock led to riots, with mobs attacking the mansions of known lenders. The Emperor Tiberius was forced to intervene, not out of kindness, but to prevent a full-scale civil war. In medieval Europe, 1347. The pressure for relief was growing, but nature provided the reset before politics could. The Black Death arrived. It killed debtor and creditor alike. But crucially, it created a labor shortage so severe that the surviving serfs could demand higher wages, effectively breaking the feudal debt system. The plague was a biological jubilee that shattered the financial hierarchy. In France, 1789. Never forget this. The French Revolution was, at its core, a debt restructuring negotiation that went wrong. The Third Estate, the people, demanded the king default on the debts owed to the aristocracy. They argued the debt was illegitimate, incurred by corrupt elites for wars that didn't benefit the nation. The aristocracy refused to take a haircut. They demanded higher taxes on the poor to make the bond payments. The result? The guillotine. The debt was settled with blood. In Weimar Germany, 1923, as the economy buckled under the weight of reparations, the political fringes moved to the center. Communist and Nazi parties surged in popularity, both running on platforms of breaking the debt slavery. Hitler's beer hall putsch happened in November 1923, right at the peak of the hyperinflation crisis. The economic collapse radicalized the population, making them desperate for any leader who promised to erase the burden. And in 2025, look around you. The fracture is already visible. The left demands student loan forgiveness, rent control, and modern monetary theory, money printing. They argue the debt is predatory. The right argues that inflation is theft, that the central banks have destroyed the middle class, and demands a return to sound money. The center cannot hold. We are seeing the rise of populism, the distrust of institutions, and the demand for a reset from both sides, even if they define it differently. This political chaos is not an accident. It is a symptom of stage 5. And when the political pressure becomes unbearable, the dam breaks. We enter the final, inevitable phase. Stage 6. The reset, hyperinflation, Jubilee, or war. This is the event horizon. The moment the debt is actually eliminated. Not paid back, eliminated. History shows us there are only 3 mechanisms for this to happen. Method 1. Hyperinflation, the destruction of currency. This is the most common choice because it is the path of least resistance for politicians. It allows them to pretend they are paying the debt while destroying its value. In Rome, emperors began clipping the coins, reducing the silver content of the denarius. By 300 AD, the currency was 95% base metal. The debts were technically paid, but the money used to pay them was worthless. In revolutionary France, the government seized church lands and issued paper money called assignats, backed by that land. It worked for a moment. Then they printed more and more. By 1794, the assignat had lost 99.9% of its value. A gold louis that cost 20 assignats in 1790 cost 3,000 inches, 1,794. The national debt was wiped out because the currency used to denominate it ceased to function. In Weimar Germany, 1923, the most famous example, the Reichsbank printed 500 quintillion marks a day. Workers were paid twice a day and rushed to buy bread before the price doubled. A lifetime of savings could not buy a newspaper. But here is the secret. The debts were wiped out. Mortgages, business loans, war bonds, all erased. The winners were the debtors, the losers were the savers, and the middle class who held paper assets. Method 2. The negotiated Jubilee, the hard reset. This is rare, but possible. It happens when the creditors realize that getting something is better than getting nothing. Post-World War II Europe, 1953. West Germany was buried under a mountain of debt it could never repay. The Allies, learning from the disaster of Weimar, convened the London Debt Agreement. They voluntarily cancelled 50% of Germany's debt and restructured the rest at ultra-low rates. It was a global Jubilee. It reset the German economy and laid the foundation for the Wirtschaftswunder, economic miracle. But it required the creditors, the US, UK, France, to take a massive loss. Method 3. War. The physical reset. The darkest timeline. When politics fails and inflation isn't enough, war resets the board. It destroys physical capital, kills creditors, and reshuffles geopolitical power so completely that the old debts become irrelevant. World War II effectively reset the Great Depression's debt load through massive mobilization and post-war reconstruction. So, where does that leave us today? We have walked through the history. We have seen the pattern. We are currently standing in the volatility of stage 5, staring down the barrel of stage 6. The question is not if the reset comes. The question is which method will be chosen for us. Based on the current trajectory of the United States and the global central banks, we can predict the likely outcome with terrifying accuracy. So, how does this end for the United States? We can look at the data and see exactly which lever they are pulling. The prediction, the soft hyperinflation. The United States government will not choose Method 2 Jubilee because it requires a political consensus that does not exist. They will try to avoid Method 3 total war because the nuclear risks are too high. That leaves Method 1. But it won't look like Weimar Germany with wheelbarrows of cash, at least not yet. It will look like a slow, suffocating strangulation of your purchasing power. The Federal Reserve and the Treasury have already chosen their path. Financial repression. They are going to run inflation hot, likely in the 10% to 15% range year after year, for a decade. They will lie about the numbers. They will tell you inflation is 3% while your grocery bill doubles. Why? Because this allows them to perform a soft default. They will pay back the $36 trillion. Every single penny, but they will pay it back with dollars that are worth 50% less than they are today. They transfer the debt from their balance sheet to your cost of living. It is a tax that nobody voted for, and nobody can dodge. We saw the preview in 2021 and 2022. Official inflation hit 9%, but if you use the calculation methods from 1980, real inflation was over 15%. That was not an accident. That was the pilot program for the reset. When this mechanism locks into place, and we are seeing it lock in right now, as bond yields spike, society will undergo the most violent transfer of wealth in human history. The middle class will be hollowed out. You need to understand who the victims are, because if you are holding these positions, you are standing directly in the blast zone. Victim class has shown. The savers, cash holders. This is the tragedy of the system. The people who did everything right, who worked hard, lived below their means, and saved cash in the bank, are the ones who will be slaughtered. If you have $100,000 in a savings account, and real inflation runs at 15% for 5 years, your purchasing power is cut in half. You still have $100,000 on the screen, but it only buys $50,000 worth of goods. The bank didn't steal your money. The currency stole your value. Cash is not a safe haven during stage 6. Cash is a melting ice cube. Victim class #2, the fixed income class. This includes retirees on pensions, Social Security recipients, and anyone relying on annuities. This is the moral crime of the reset. Your check comes in the mail every month for the exact same amount, $2,000. But gas is $8 a gallon. Bread is $10 a loaf. Electricity is up 300%. In Weimar Germany, the pensioners starved first. They had guaranteed income, but the guarantee was denominated in paper that became trash. In the US, Social Security will likely receive cost of living adjustments, but they will lag behind real inflation by years. The standard of living for the elderly will collapse. Victim class #3, the creditors. This is anyone who lent money. If you own bonds, you are a creditor. If you have a conservative 401k allocated 60/40 to stocks and bonds, you are a creditor. When you buy a treasury bond paying 4%, you are lending money to the government. But if inflation is 15%, your real return is negative 11%. You are paying the government for the privilege of lending them money. During a debt reset, the bond market is not a sanctuary, it is a slaughterhouse. This is why we are seeing major foreign nations dumping US treasuries. They know the math. They know they will be paid back in ghost money. This paints a bleak picture. But remember, energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transferred. Wealth is the same. When it evaporates from the accounts of the savers and the creditors, it doesn't disappear into thin air. It flows somewhere else. While the majority are losing everything, a small minority, those who understand the pattern, are about to experience a windfall. There are two groups that win during a currency reset: the debtors and the hard asset owners. The debtors win. This sounds counterintuitive. We are taught that debt is bad. But during a high inflation reset, fixed rate debt becomes an asset. Imagine you owe $300,000 on a 30-year fixed rate mortgage at 4%. Inflation explodes to 20%. Your wages eventually rise nominally to keep up with the cost of bread and milk, but your mortgage payment never changes. The bank is stuck receiving payments that are worth less and less every month. By year 10, you are paying off your house with pocket change. You effectively shorted the dollar, and the bank took the other side of the trade. The hard asset owners win. A house is a house. An ounce of gold is an ounce of gold. A barrel of oil is a barrel of oil. Their value is intrinsic. It comes from their utility, not their price tag. If the dollar collapses, the price of the house in dollars goes to the moon. Not because the house is better, but because the dollar is worse. The house preserves the purchasing power. Those who hold things survive. Those who hold paper perish. This brings us to the most critical part of this entire decoding. Now that you know the pattern stages 1 to 6, and you know the mechanism, inflationary reset, what specifically should you do? There are 3 specific positions that have survived every single one of these crises, from 1929 to Weimar to Rome. If you position yourself here, you don't just survive the reset, you profit from the chaos. Here is your battle plan. These are the 3 positions that separate the victims from the victors when the currency dies. Position #1. The liquidity shield, minimize cash holdings. You must fundamentally rewire your brain. We are taught that cash is king. In a deflationary crash, that is true. But in an inflationary reset, stage 6 cash is the enemy. It is the asset class that is guaranteed to lose. Do not hold large amounts of cash or cash equivalent assets like money market funds. These are unsecured liabilities of a bankrupt system. When inflation hits 15% or 20%, holding cash is like trying to carry water in a sieve. Keep only what you absolutely need for 3 to 6 months of emergency expenses. Everything else must be deployed. Standing on the sidelines is not safety. It is a slow death by devaluation. Position #2, the fortress of value, hard assets. You must convert your paper wealth into physical reality. Focus on assets that cannot be printed by a central bank. Real estate. Specifically, income-producing real estate. Rents rise with inflation. Property values rise as the currency collapses. It is a double hedge. Commodities, gold and silver. This is not an investment, it is insurance. For 5,000 years, gold has survived every government reset. It is the only money that has no counterparty risk. Productive businesses own pieces of companies that produce essential goods, food, energy, shelter, things people need, regardless of what the currency is worth. These assets survive because they have utility. A reset changes the price tag, but it never changes the value. Position #3. The inflation arbitrage, strategic debt. This is the most controversial yet powerful move in the playbook. Consider taking on fixed-rate debt to acquire those hard assets. A 30-year mortgage locked in at 6% is a gift from the gods if inflation runs at 15% for the next decade. You are borrowing expensive dollars today to buy a hard asset, and you will pay the bank back later with cheap, devalued dollars. You are effectively letting the government's inflation pay off your debts for you. The bank loses. You win. This is how the great fortunes were preserved in Weimar Germany. The warning signal. Watch the 10-year treasury. How will you know when stage 6 has truly begun? Do not watch the stock market. Do not watch the news. Watch the bond yields. Specifically, the US 10-year treasury. When the yield spikes above 6% or 7% and stays there, that is the canary in the coal mine. It means the creditors have lost faith. It means they are demanding higher returns because they see the inflation coming. That is the signal that the system has lost control. Do not assume you have a decade to prepare. The pattern dictates that the time from stage 3, where we are now, to stage 6 is typically 3 to 7 years. We entered stage 3 in 2020. The clock is ticking. We might have until 2027, or the dam could break by 2025. Historical patterns always accelerate as they reach their conclusion. It is better to be a year early than a day late. The final verdict. 5 times in 2,000 years, the debt reached the mathematical point of no return. 5 times, civilization was reset. Ancient Rome, medieval Europe, revolutionary France, Weimar Germany, post-war Europe. The names change, the technology changes, but the pattern is eternal. 6 stages, from credit expansion to debt annihilation. Right now, the global debt is 335% of GDP. The interest payments are consuming the world. The math is undeniable. We are leaving stage 3 and accelerating through stages 4 and 5. Stage 6 is not a possibility. It is a gravity-bound certainty. The only question left is simple. When the music stops, will you be holding the bag of worthless paper promises, or will you be positioned in the assets that survive? History is very clear about what happens next. The debt will not be repaid. It will be erased. And in that chaos, wealth will transfer from the believers to the prepared. This channel exists for one reason: to track this pattern in real time. We are building the map as we walk through the territory. If you want to understand the timeline, if you want to know when we cross from stage 5 to stage 6, you need to be here. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, because the answers to your future are written in the past, and I will help you read them before it is too late. See you in the next decoding.